let's think about this for a second. Can an 18th century political blueprint, one that was literally designed back in the age of kings and horse-drawn carriages, actually withstand the intense, high-speed pressures of modern populism? It's a massive question, right? And it's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating clash documented by legal scholars. We're looking at the collision between Charles Montesquieu's centuries-old idea of the separation of powers and the modern reality of populist executive power, especially as we saw during the administration of Donald Trump. We're going to explore exactly why Montesquieu built his system in the first place and why it experiences such profound friction when a leader comes along who assumes traditional institutions are just obstacles to the people's will. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the threat of despotism. Second, Montesquieu's architecture of freedom. Third, the populist challenge. Fourth, the unitary executive theory. And finally, clashing visions of democracy. Let's jump in. Section 1. The threat of despotism, the historical problem. So, for most of human history, power sat squarely in the hands of kings or a very, very small elite. And as you might guess, that kind of concentration almost always leads to despotism. The core mechanism of a despotic regime? It's fear. Without limits, human nature kind of dictates that anyone with power will inevitably seek more power. When all the cards are held by one person, that ruler can just intervene arbitrarily, completely crushing the courage and the freedom of everyday citizens. Preventing this absolute concentration of power was literally the primary obsession of Enlightenment thinkers.
Which brings us to Section 2. Montesquieu's vision, the architecture of freedom. Enter Charles Montesquieu. He was an 18th century French nobleman and legal scholar. Back in 1748, he published his absolute masterpiece, De l'Esprit des Lois, or The Spirit of the Laws. Based on his empirical observations of history, he was desperately looking for a practical, mechanical way to protect individuals from the overwhelming power of the state.
And his brilliant solution is what we now call the Trias Politica. This is the absolute cornerstone of modern constitutional democracies. Montesquieu argued that a state only functions well if there's a strict separation of three powers. You've got the legislative power to make the laws, the executive power to enforce them, and the judicial power to judge them. By dividing these functions up, you prevent any single entity, whether that's a king, a parliament, or a judge, from completely dominating the whole government. It's like a giant puzzle where no single piece can take over the board.
His crucial point really boils down to this one golden rule: power must stop power. Montesquieu brilliantly envisioned government not as a single, unified force, but as a machine built on carefully calibrated friction. You see, you couldn't just trust leaders to be good people. You had to design a system where competing institutional powers inherently block each other.
And this perfectly illustrates his really unique definition of freedom. For Montesquieu, freedom wasn't simply about doing whatever the majority wants at any given moment. Not at all. Rather, freedom is the inner peace and security of knowing you are safe from arbitrary power. It's that comforting knowledge that your private life is protected by independent judges and fair laws, completely immune to the sudden whims of a ruler. All right, Section 3, the populist challenge, direct rule. To understand why this beautiful 18th century system struggles today, we have to look at the populist worldview. Populism claims to rely on direct popular sovereignty. A populist leader often operates on the assumption that the traditional democratic system is fundamentally broken, or even that the general public doesn't really understand how a true democracy functions. Therefore, the leader argues that the direct will of the majority absolutely must override those slow historical constitutional constraints. They act as if the president holds all the power simply because they view themselves as the sole legitimate voice of the people.
Legal scholars actually describe this as populist constitutionalism, a project that systematically tries to remove historical checks and balances. These movements globally often reject legitimate pluralism, meaning they just don't accept political opposition as valid. They seek to dismantle independent agencies and significantly weaken judicial constraints. You see, to a populist, Montesquieu's machine of friction isn't protecting freedom at all. It's just an annoying obstacle getting in the way of the national interest.
Moving to Section 4, Unitary Executive, the American context. This brings us directly to modern American politics, and a legal concept that gained massive traction during the Trump administration, the unitary executive theory. Scholars point out that this theory places the president right at the absolute apex of federal power. It argues that Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution gives the president exclusive, completely unbound control over the entire executive branch.
In this view, congressional limits on the president are basically seen as unconstitutional.
The sources break down exactly how this theory is actively exercised. It starts with claiming absolute executive control, but crucially, it involves the power to remove any federal official without cause, meaning the president can essentially fire people for political reasons or just because they resist controversial orders. It also asserts that the president has the exclusive power to decide exactly which laws to enforce, effectively bypassing congressional limitations. It's a highly centralized vision of power that perfectly aligns with the populist desire for direct, unhindered executive action. And hey, this isn't just academic theory. It's actively playing out in the courts right now. Take the Supreme Court case Seal a Law LLC versus Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. In this landmark ruling, the court authorized the president to remove the head of an independent agency without cause. Critics argue that stripping away these for-cause protections removes a massive check on power, making it vastly easier for a president to consolidate control over the entire government apparatus.
Finally, Section 5, Clashing Visions, Systems in Conflict. Stepping back, we can see exactly why these two systems fundamentally short-circuit each other. On one side, we have Montesquieu's Trias Politica, which relies on shared power and institutional checks, firmly believing that freedom is achieved through the security of a balanced system. On the exact opposite side, the unitary populist vision relies on a concentrated executive, believing freedom is achieved by empowering a single leader to take absolute action. Montesquieu built a machine where power stops power. The unitary model essentially seeks to remove the brakes entirely. The framers of the U.S. Constitution were deeply aware of this exact tension. Relying heavily on Montesquieu's logic, James Madison warned in the Federalist Papers that accumulating all powers in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. They intentionally designed a system of collaborative oversight, not a dictatorship of the executive. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. As modern legal and political battles continue to test the very boundaries of executive authority, we really have to ask ourselves, if we systematically dismantle the friction Montesquieu designed, if power no longer stops power, what ultimately protects the freedom and security of the individual? It's a question that history demands we answer, and one that is definitely going to shape the future of modern democracies. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the architecture of the world around you.